I just had a question about the digital rights management and the protection of books or book content. I think Paula was the only one who actually mentioned digital rights management. But how do each of you see that being managed in the growing ebook market and the device market, and what's the future? How much of it is digital rights management going to be a growing problem? How do publishers tackle that? How do authors come to grips with that? How does it reassure them? And how do end users respond to it? What's the future for us there?
We've got at Booki.sh, we've got a very different take on it from the other folk because of the nature of our platform. Our books are protected using what we call 21st century digital rights management, which is username and password, and we have ways of judging whether books are being accessed by, lots of different people, or whether they're being accessed by one person on a number of different devices. And crucially, we're able to allow human beings to judge whether a pattern of usage is wrong, is a violation of our copyright agreements with publishers, or if it's just a human being stumbling around and using a few different devices and accessing, and doing something that's kind of not the standard read on one device throughout the day kind of activity. Digital rights management is a huge issue for copyright holders. Obviously, you need to protect your work, but it's also at the moment a huge impediment to people reading, and publishers have to balance that. I don't have great strategies for publishers to employ, or political views about whether you should just abandon it now or just wait until you inevitably abandon it in 5 years. But I do think that you have to be very aware of the barriers it places in front of people who are just trying to read your books. So we have the luxury of having a pretty easy road to sensible DRM at Booki.sh, which file-based systems don't have the luxury of.
So we have that exact same luxury, which I'll talk about in a sec. I think the first thing I'd say is just really fundamental, and I cannot stress this enough. The best thing that you can do to protect yourself from privacy is to make your book easily available at what was earlier referred to as at a fair price. Now, if someone comes and looks for your book and cannot find that particular book on Google, on Kobo, on Apple, on Kindle, on Booki.sh, on wherever, and consumers are pretty smart and savvy. If they actually can't find that book and that book's not in their local bookstore, that's sort of generally at the stage when they might consider, trying to find it through some other mechanism. If you make it available and easy to do, which is sort of what the iTunes model did for music and what everyone on this stage is trying to do for books, that's the absolute best way to allow people to do it. Most people, the vast majority of the time, will be very happy to pay for your books. There will always some small fraction of society that will always try and get around that, and we have various methods for stopping those people. But please do make sure you clear rights, make book available, because that's the best way to stop it. Google operates on a similar system to Booki.sh. Google Accounts, which is your account that you may use with Gmail or YouTube or a whole range of other Google products that are out there, is a very, very safe and secure account mechanism. We have a very, very big security team that works constantly around the world, around the clock, working on this issue. If, for instance, we see that, I was in Asia recently, so Mark's in Sydney and he's reading his book, and then all of a sudden Mark's in, Singapore reading his book, a couple of days later. That's not, that might sort of raise some level of a query, but if Mark reads a book the next day and then comes back to Australia a couple of days later and starts reading again in Australia, that's kind of a normal usage pattern. If Mark's reading his book in Australia today and then half an hour later he's reading it in Moscow, not so usual. And so, if I'm reading it here and then all of a sudden this other device, while I'm reading page 39, this other device starts reading page 143, and then another device starts reading page 2, yes, that's also not a sort of common usage thing. So through patterns like that and pattern recognition, and we have a huge amount of sort of experience in this field, we're very good on that. We also have a range of encryption within our apps and other sort of files as well that is constantly updated. So if anyone is trying to sort of tinker with it or try and do anything on our system, it's sort of almost impossible to, you never want to say it's totally impossible because you never know, but I think very, 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 very strong. We have not had a publisher come to us with an issue that they thought someone got around our DRM.
And to round it out quickly, if you're on Kobo, you can choose to have DRM or not. That's a decision that we defer to you, and Kobo doesn't take a position or presume to tell you what to do. If you're asking me personally what my opinion is, DRM, as it was in other digital formats, is an impediment to purchase. It's another step that blocks the user, and as price is an issue, it becomes more of an issue for the user to actively engage in piracy. I don't think DRM will last. But, are we talking the 5-year time frame or the 3? I can see why everyone wants to hang on to it because there's a degree of certainty in locking your books away. But, there's a consumer who has expectations, and I know I bang on about this all the time. That doesn't mean they're right. This is just what they do. So ultimately, if DRM gets in the way of the consumer experience more and more, then there'll be more and more piracy.
There's also an interesting comment to make around, looking at the music industry as an example. DRM can have a sort of an odd sort of negative effect as well. Because you couldn't move your files, iTunes became this very, very popular platform, and because through DRM, Apple's DRM only worked in iTunes, so you could only use iTunes to play your music. So you could only use Apple devices to play your music, and after a while you've spent thousands of dollars on your music on using iTunes. And yes, you can have iTunes on Windows or Mac or on your iPhone or whatever else. But all of a sudden, when some local Australian retailer goes digital and starts selling digital files, you think to yourself, well, why would I bother? Because I'm already using iTunes and all my stuff's on there, and this isn't compatible easily. The record labels realised how bad this was, and it was totally stifling competition because people were locked into one platform, and that platform was Apple. They forced Apple to remove DRM. The big 4 labels, music labels, sort of pulled back from that and removed DRM. So now when you buy a tune from iTunes, you can also buy a tune from other places and all mix and match. I wonder whether a similar conversation will happen because at the moment it's relatively hard, to switch between various platforms when you're reading books.
My question is about free books that are published by not-for-profit initiatives, so they're genuinely free to everybody and on other sites. Are you prepared to have them on your site?
Yes.
Yes.
I'll talk to you after.
We don't have free books in stores at the moment. I think that's important for me to note. We think stores are for selling books, and we think and Bookish users can get free books into their accounts in other ways, but we do try and keep that separate from the commerce aspect of what we're doing.
Yeah, I've got a couple of questions about what percentage of books sold in this country are now eBooks. One of them, I think Hachette said the other day that 10%, and I'm wondering if any of you guys can elaborate on whether you think that's...
Do you have a hat?
Do I have...
Because there's a rabbit in it, who could tell you. There will be no... Mark will say something, and it might have been something I made up, or I might say something, it might have been something Mark set up. There's no measurable at the moment.
There are no industry statistics around ebooks in Australia, no openly available ones. And it's very annoying. I wish there were. To try and answer your question, the best answer that I get, is because Malcolm and I and Virginia as well, we spend our time talking to publishers, and so I talk to publishers, multiple times every single day, and part of this, inevitably is talking about what percentage of sales they're seeing as ebooks and the sort of growth around there. I would say that Hachette actually said it was 12%. Simon & Schuster came out and said the other day that they expect it to be 10% this year. I would think that the top end is doing around 10%, the big guys on trade. There are a lot of people who are doing 0% because they haven't gotten started yet. So there's a big mix in between there.
I think the problem is that you're asking us to define a percentage of a trade book sale, and we're selling also educational books and a lot of other books that don't normally appear in the trade figures. So if you if you want to try and estimate the value of that market, you know, you could have that as a shot. I'm not going to be the guy who gives away that information in a public forum. But, you know, it's obviously tens of millions of dollars, whether it's hundreds. You know, that would be for you to estimate based on what you think Hachette and Simon & Schuster might be. It's all a guessing game at the moment, and that's about as good as you're going to get. I will say, though, that whatever it is today, it's probably going to be somewhere upwards of double to triple by this time next year.
Yeah, that's the only thing I'd echo. It's whatever it is, it's growing.
I think it was you, Malcolm, that put up the chart about prices and the volume sold at particular price brackets. How responsive are you finding Australia's major trade publishers to that sort of feedback as to how they're pricing? In my experience, you know, if you've got a new release at, say, $30, $29.95, then they're pricing the ebook at, you know, maybe 20% off that, but certainly not in the $10 to $15 bracket where the volume is.
I think in political terms we call that a reverse Dorothy Dixon. Publishers have come a long way in the last year towards, you know, being where the market thinks they should be. It's interesting, I'll answer your question with a few points. When I said $9.99 was the expectation of price, and Mark said that there was a huge volume at $12.99 through to $14.99, that doesn't mean that those people purchasing at that point still aren't expecting the book to be cheaper. They're just happy to have their expectations elasticized a little. So it's the same with the publishers. Their expectation of price is a little higher, and they're just bending a little further and further back. And as the volume changes, they're changing too. I must say that the change in this market has perhaps been a little slower than in other markets, and that's demonstrated by the reported market share of major trade publishers here as opposed to their parents overseas or in Canada or in the US. So there are some publishers who are leading the pack. No, you know, there is no homogeneity of action amongst them, and there are some who are still playing a waiting game.
I'd say that since, you know, Google entered a few months ago, you know, over Christmas there were some who were very, very aggressive on price, and they shipped a hell of a lot of units, and everyone else was watching what those guys are doing. I think I'd phrase it like this: publishers are taking price very, very seriously and thinking about it all the time, and I think they're getting better at pricing to the market.